I need to go in and change what my schema is. Right? So I have this movie vote object here. Right? Everybody on the same page? So I have a movie vote. Okay. What I want to do is add in some additional data that we're going to use to pull information about the movie itself. And one thing I could do is I could say, well, why don't we just take the entire movie document and stuff it into the vote document, right? So one thing I could do is I could say here, I say public movie. And so now I've got the entire movie document inside of the movie vote document. I could do that, okay? In reality, we looked at this and we said, well, I only need some of the data, right? I'm going to find that I don't need all of the data necessarily in the movie. I just want some of the data. So rather than stuffing the whole movie in there, I might create a separate class, which I'm going to call the movie summary. So movie summary, which is just the data that I need for this purpose. So a good way to start this might be to just take everything that's in the movie and copy it over to the movie summary. Right, I might start here. I might start here and just say, hey, movie summary is the whole thing. Okay. And if I look at the pieces that I found out I needed, I found out I needed an ID, I found out I needed a name, I found out I needed a director, and the image, and the genre, and I think that actually unfortunately ends up being all the data I have right now, right? The gotcha is it won't be all of the data in the future, right? So one of the things that we're going to do next week is we're going to add a detail screen, and on that detail screen I will have more data, right? So tomorrow I will, not tomorrow, next week I will be adding more data to the movie collection, but it won't be added to this movie summary object. So everybody following with me that? So right now, today, they're the same. Next week, that will change. Okay. So another gotcha here, because I'm going to use it nested, this ID will no longer be the ID of the document itself. So I don't want to add the ID annotation for this nested one. Okay. In fact, I might just want to take the ID column out. I might just want to do it like so. So that's one gotcha for the summary. I might want to remove the ID. Let me make a note here. So we don't accidentally put it in there. Because if you left that, especially with the annotation, then you would find that that would be the ID of the vote and not the ID of the movie. Okay? So that's our movie summary. And so inside of movie vote, I will have a movie summary. Make sense? So movie summary is just a copy of that data. I'll implement that on the server side. This will be implemented as a map, but it actually does know how to turn that, take that map and turn it into an object. We haven't done that yet, but you can do that. Cool. So you have the option of, if you create it as a map on the console side, you can on the client side in your code, you can either represent that as a map or you can represent that as an object, depending on what your needs are. Cool. Questions? Does that make sense, what I'm doing here? Just that quick change to the model is now changed how things operate. Now, I need to make sure that that data gets pushed up the way that I need that created now. So I need to go back to the view model. Okay, so I'm going to go to movie list view model, and I'm going to go up to where I add this vote. So when I add the vote, okay, this is the method that's being called. Notice the parameters there, the movie ID and the value. Everybody see that? Movie ID and value. Now I've got a little bit of a problem. Is that all of the data that I need to populate the summary? It's not, right? I'm missing the name of the movie, the image, the director, the genre. I'm missing all of that information. Does everybody see that? So I do need to rejigger things a little bit in order to have that data. Okay. What can I do? Well,
Trying to just query the database for the latest information?
I could query the database for the information. Is that going to be free?
No.
No. So if I have to query the database, then every time the user clicks the vote button, I now have to do another read. Okay. Do I already have that data? Is that movie already on the user screen? Yes, right? User just clicked on the movie. They just clicked upload on the movie, which means I already have the updated data. Does that make sense? I already have the updated data. I don't need to make another trip to the database to get it. Now, I don't want to. Okay? So what that means is I need to somehow get it. Okay? Well, for the moment, I'm just going to say, I know the user has it. I'm going to get it in here somehow. So I'm going to change that first argument from just being the ID of the movie to I'm just going to say, hey, give me an entire movie object instead. Make sense? We'll work our way back and figure out how we're going to get that movie object. It won't be that hard. Okay? So let's say I've got that. Right? So I'm going to get an entire movie object. Here I'm still expecting the movie ID. So I need to change that over to movie.id. Okay? Because now it's a property of that object. Same thing here on line 152. This is movie.id. I've got movie.id instead of movie ID. Okay. So what you missed is I changed the first parameter from a string object, string movie ID. It's now movie, right? So I'm getting an entire movie object. Okay. So I've got to change those two lines where I'm referencing the ID. I also need to save that additional data. So remember that on the model we said, okay, well we've got another property called movie. And in there I want to stuff the movie, right? Except this would stuff the entire movie document in there. Right? So I said I just want part of the data. Is everybody following me with that? Mm-hmm. I just want part of the data. So how can I pick off part of the data and get a movie summary instead of a movie? Yeah?
Can you just make another hash map?
Another hash map?
Mm-hmm.
I could.
You said it was going to be a map anyway.
I could make another hash map here, populate that, and let me do that real quick just so I can show how you would do that. I'm going to do something different, but I'll show you how you could do that. So I could say hash map string object and then I could start picking off just the pieces of data that I want. So for instance, I could say, I need to spell that right, summary. I could just say movie summary dot put. I could say like name movie dot name movie summary dot put image right, for all the different pieces. So I build up a hash map, and then I put that inside of the other hash map, inside of the other hash map. Does that make sense? But I could do that. Oh, and I need to make sure that I stuff the movie summary in there and not the entire movie. So I do need to make sure that that line 153 is the movie summary and not the whole movie. But I've got the summary class. Shouldn't I maybe use it? Maybe. I've got a summary. Why don't I just take advantage of that? So what I'd like to do instead of this is I'd like to say something to the effect of movie summary, make an actual movie summary object, construct it using the movie itself, and then actually I can stuff that directly in. So I can just say vote dot put movie so I'd rather prefer to do this over that. I'd rather do this than the thing I just copied out. Rather than building another hash map, I'd rather just be able to create a movie summary object and put it in. Does that make sense? Code already looks shorter, right? In the grand scheme of things, it doesn't make the code shorter because I'm still going to have to write the same amount of code to make this work. The gotcha is that if I need to add additional fields, it's easier to update. Okay, if I need to change the types or fields that are in a summary, this is a lot easier to keep those things in sync. Cool? Because this is not obvious. If you go with this approach, you're going to find that, oh, we added another field to the movie and we forgot to add it to the code. Okay? Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So how do I need to do this? Well, the part it's complaining about is that there's no constructor that takes a movie. So I need to make that constructor. So I'm going to hold Control, click, go back into the movie summary, and I'm going to add two constructors. First one, public movie summary, is just going to be my empty constructor. Okay, because remember I need an empty constructor. I'm then going to add the other constructor, which is the one I want to actually implement. So this is movie summary. Movie summary. It's going to take a movie, and I'm going to use that movie to construct a summary. The good news is this is really easy. So this.name is equal to movie.name. This.director is equal to movie.director. This dot release here is equal to movie dot release here. This dot image is equal to movie dot image. This dot genre is equal to movie dot genre. Commonly, this constructor would be referred to as sort of a copy constructor, because I'm kind of making a copy of the movie. It's just that I'm not making a copy of the movie. I'm kind of pushing that data into a movie summary. So effectively, this gives me a way to easily convert a movie into a movie summary, right? And if it turns out, as I was saying, if I need to add additional fields, this is the only class I have to update. And it's pretty obvious because I've defined all the fields up here at the top of the class and the constructors here in the class as well. So it's really obvious, like, oh, I make a change to the top of the file, I need to make a change to the constructor as well. Make sense? You kind of see the value of doing that? So I'd rather do it this way. Okay? Questions? Does that make sense?
So that's a subdocument.
It's not a subdocument. It's still a map.
It's still a map.
It's still a map.
Okay.
It's not a subdocument. Subdocument would mean, remember I have document, subcollection, subdocument.
Oh, okay.
There have to be a subcollection in there somewhere, but I'm not creating a subdocument or a subcollection. Cool? Because it's just a nested piece of data. All right. So does that make sense in terms of adding the data? Does this alleviate your concerns a little bit about how amount of code you have to change? Cody, Michael? Not that much in the grand scheme of things. So I just have to use some tricks to cut it down. So I've got that change. I want to go into, I want to look further now. So if we look at who calls add vote for movie, I need to look back because I changed the signature of this function. So instead of passing in the ID, I'm passing that in. So these two methods here, add up vote for movie and add down vote for movie, because remember I'd made this one private. There's two functions that call it because I'm trying to filter out this value thing. Both of these functions now have to update. These methods both have to update to take a movie. Instead of a movie ID. So what?
It seems like it worked out pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, those changes are pretty easy so far. I'm going to go back. So it says go to the related problem. So we're going to go next would be the adapter. Oh, good news. Mm-hmm. I already had the movie. I had the entire movie object here. So all I need to do, instead of passing movie.id, I just need to pass movie. Drop a little bit of code there. Oh, the remove is still movie.id. Because I only need the ID if I'm removing it. So I really just have to change line 98 and 89 to pass a movie instead of movie ID. Cool. So now when I upvote and downvote, I should see the actual data for the movie, the name, the director, etc. should be in the database. Okay. And I can verify that by looking at the console. So if I go right now to my console, I look at some of these documents, right? You can see what's in there right at this moment. The ID, username, value voted on. I'm going to go run the program. And I'm going to change one of my votes. So first Matrix movie, thumbs down, thumbs up. If I go back and look at the data, there's a nice movie map with that data. Awesome. Okay. Now notice that the other ones haven't updated. These votes have not changed because I didn't change my vote there. Right? So if I was going to implement this into a real world scenario, I would need to add some code somewhere to update those additional votes, probably. Okay. Now, I could do that one or two ways. I could have, if it's a small amount of data, I could just go change it manually. If I needed to change it in an automated way, I wouldn't do that through the app, more than likely. I would use a cloud function to implement that, right? So we can use, that's a place where we might use cloud functions to get the data back in sync. But we haven't talked about cloud functions yet. Okay, so for the moment, I'm just going to go manually change all my votes. So I've got this one. I'm going to change that back to an upvote. And maybe, where's the other movie? I'm just scrolling past it. There we go. So now all three of those movies have updated votes. And I've also got some ones in here. Cool. Pretty easy. That first part, pretty easy to keep it in sync. It's just a matter of taking advantage of some shortcuts, and the big thing is how I've set up this movie summary class. Just by adding that additional class, I've saved a lot of the work. And I would really recommend you do this. I want you to build a game summary class. Make sense? Because you're going to find that actually that class is useful in a lot of different places. There's a lot of places we can take advantage of that. Okay? So let's say we go back here. And the next thing I wanted to do is have it filter down the list. Okay, so you remember one thing. You remember how we set up the filter for genre. I added a filter method here, called it filter movies by genre, and then I also kind of had to move some code around to make this query movies function. With me so far? So I kind of need to do the same thing. And I might say public void filter movies by list. Okay? What parameters does this function need to take? What parameters does this function need to take?
What is the list?
So like by all the options, remember, are that second drop down. So the user's picking all movies, my votes, my upvotes, my downvotes. It's one of those four options.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. It'd be what? Here from that drop down. So it's not a movie. It's not a movie ID. We're saying which of these lists do you want to move to? You might call it a mode or something like that. This would be like, here I want all the movies, or I just want my library, or I just want my wish list. Well, we need a parameter, obviously, right? We have to know what the user picked. But what data type is that?
Do we really care what data type it is? I mean, we could use a string, we could use
a string. Integer. We could use an integer.
Can't use Boolean.
Can't use Boolean because it's not one of two values.
Okay.
Right?
I was thinking just a switch statement on whatever primitive we want to use.
Is a good answer. And actually, I would use a switch statement here, regardless of what we choose. Let's think about some of the caveats. So first up for grabs is a string. Okay. Let's say I take the string that the user sees, and I pass that through as all movies, right? What if the user's running is in Spanish, and so it's not all movies, or it's in German, and it's not all movies, it's all films or whatever. You know, it's a different string because it's a different language. Do you want this function to have to deal with all of the languages and that switch statement have to deal with every language on the planet? I don't think so, right? I don't want to have to code in here that string for every single language. Does that make sense? So if I'm passing in a string, I actually don't, I don't want to take the string off the screen. I might take like a string that's strictly in English and pass that through, but I don't want the string that the user sees. Does that make sense to everybody? I don't want the string that the user sees. I want some other string if I'm going to use a string. Another thing that was on the table is integers. Could I use an integer here? Yeah. Let's say my integers are 0, 1, 2, and 3. Are there any gotchas there? Anything that makes you worried about using the numbers 0, 1, 2, and 3 here?
It's meaningless.
It's meaningless. There's no inherent meaning to those numbers, and it depends on the order that they appear on screen. So if my designer comes along or my boss comes along and says, oh, I actually want these in this other order, I have to know that this switch statement has to be updated. And in fact, there's no way for me to know that unless I'm the one that wrote that code. So you get into, okay, your boss tells developer A to go change the order of these things. Developer B is the one who wrote the switch statement. So developer A doesn't know how to change the switch statement because they're not the one that wrote it. And now they pick my upvotes and it shows them all their votes because it's out of order. Yes? Where are you going to put that note? So let's say I put a node in here. I think you mean a comment. So 0 equals all movies, right? And I say like, well, 1 equals my votes. How is developer A supposed to know that there's a comment here? They didn't write this code, right? They didn't write this code. They're working on the UI. They made a change in the XML. How would they know to make a change in the view model? They wouldn't, right? Does that make sense? The only way that you would even see that comment is if you were looking at this code for some reason. And more than likely they wouldn't be. Yeah.
So is there some way to like switch based on the ID of the list item? Remember how they have like r.string that ID or r.driver, or what are these? Are these like at compile time the four are going to be there, right? Like it's
right.
This is a static list. It's never going to change.
So that's a good question. Yeah. So if I'm looking at string IDs do have an ID. So I could do a switch statement like switch and maybe I say this is int string res. If I did something like this, and do an alt-enter to import this. So I could switch on that, right? I get the integer that's the ID of the string somehow. and switch based on that. Okay, now there's a little bit of a gotcha. How do I get that ID to begin with? Because if I'm looking at, say, a text view or a spinner, I actually have no way of getting that ID. So, because like if I'm looking, remember if I'm looking at, say, an edit text, I can call get text, but there's no like get string ID.
I thought you said that. Sorry.
I can't get back to the original ID. So it's a reasonable suggestion, but I don't think it's workable. I think there's a way that I can see implementing that, but I don't think it's really maybe the best choice. You're kind of seeing this. You're kind of seeing the downsides, right? You're kind of seeing your options, right? So what do we put on the table? We put the idea of using a string. We said maybe that's not. I don't want to use that because translations. I still have on the table that I could use some other string that's not language specific. So I could say, well, we'll just use the special strings, like maybe all votes and the special strings my votes. So I'll just make some magic strings, and I just know I have to pass those in from the other side that calls this function. That I have to somehow take the entry that the user entered and turn it into this. Is everybody with me there? Yeah, you had a hand up? Okay. Is that the, but, and then we also talk about two ideas with integer. I could use the position in the list, or I could use some sort of string resource. Okay. So it's 4 options. I would argue there's another option that's better. Okay. So I said you're right. We probably want to have a switch statement here. Okay. It's been a while since we've touched one, and we haven't touched one in this course. But there's a particular type of thing that works really well with switch statements. Is that ringing anybody's memory? Say, hey, I have 4 options. I can only pick from those 4 options. What does that sound like?
What's the first letter of the word you're looking for?
E. Starts with an E. Again, it's been a while since you've touched one. Okay. So, do you remember hearing about enumerations or enums?
Mm-hmm.
Enums are amazing. And enum is the right solution for this problem. It is the solution that we should use here. Okay. So, let's create an enum. I'm gonna comment this function out for now, so it's not breaking anything. And I'm gonna go back over to here, and I'm gonna create a new Java class. Okay. Now, under Java class, we've been here a few times. Do you see there's 4 options? So you can create a class, you can create an interface, you can create an enum, or you can create an annotation. These are all 4 different kind of data types or files that you can create in Java. Let's go for number 3. Door number 3, we're going to call this the what do I want to call this? Maybe I'll call it list mode or something of that sort. List mode or movie list mode. Maybe I'm just going to call it movie list. So movie list is an enum. And within that enum, I need to define the 4 options that we have. So within there, I'm going to put them in the same order right now that we have them in the dropdown. All movies, I have all movies, I have my votes, my upvotes, my downvotes. So what I've just defined is here's a data type that can only take on one of 4 values. Technically it can also be null because movie lists, because enums are reference types in the world of Java. It's just unusual because most languages that's not the case. Usually they're primitive types, but here they are reference types. Does that make sense? So I've got a descriptive name, and so does this answer the question of like how would I tell the developer about those options? I've documented it, right? And unlike putting it in a comment, which they have to know to look and read, and might actually be wrong, this is something that's actually used by the compiler, so it's much easier to find. Does that make sense for everybody? So it's got a descriptive name, and in some sense, it's kind of like I'm giving 0 the name all movies, my votes is 1, my upvotes is 2, my downvotes is 3, because there's kind of a number associated with these. Okay? Cool? Everybody good with this so far? Okay, so I want to go back to my function. And so in the view model, what I want to do is I want to take this option. Now, the good news is that I don't actually now need to put any sort of switch in terms of this function. I will have a switch somewhere, but I won't have it here. So here I'm just going to say, well, let's save that to a variable. So kind of like I saved from the other filter method, I saved it to an instance variable. I need to add another instance variable. So I'm going to say up top, let's go and save this here. Private movie list. Filter list or whatever. Filter list. Okay. Now, by default, how do I want to filter the movies?
All.
All. Okay. So I'm going to actually default this to movie list dot all movies. That's my default value. Everybody cool with that? So that's my default there. Okay. Back to where we were. So I'm just going to say this dot filter list is equal to list, and then run query movies. Because I need to run a new query based on that option that the user just picked. Does that make sense? Make sense for everybody? Okay, so in here, I'm going to need to do some sort of filtering. Okay, I need to end up producing a query, but I need to kind of do it differently. The collection that it comes from depends on what list it's out of. Okay, so let's say I'm going to comment this code out for a minute. Okay, so that's the code we had previously there. I need it to produce a query, so I'm going to go ahead and declare that variable, and I'm going to add a switch. And so based on the option that the user picked, we're going to change the behavior of how that query is built out. Okay, so in the case that it is all votes, You'll notice there's a shorthand here because it already knows that it's that enumeration, so I just need to put the key and not movie list dot all movies. I just need to say all movies. Okay. So in this case, I'll go ahead and add the break so I don't forget it. I'm going to say, okay, well, query is equal to that. Okay. If it's all movies, then I'm going to go and grab the movies. All the movies. If it's a different case, so case my votes, if it's just the movies that they're voted on, well, the query should be to another collection. db.collection, and this would be movie votes, I believe. Is that what I called the collection? Oh, movie vote. Yes, movie vote. Okay. Break. Now, what about the other cases? If I want just the things I've uploaded, which collection do I need to go to? If I just want the things that I've uploaded, what collection do we need to query?
Still the same collection, movie vote.
Movie vote. But
you just limit it to the value.
Right. So here I need to say case my upvotes query is db.collection, and I need to say movie vote again dot where. Okay. Now remember remember the values that I use for upvotes and downvotes. Upvotes are 1 and downvotes are -1. Okay. But oftentimes I may want to not necessarily assume those specific values. I may want to say, oh, it's greater than or equal to 0. That way, any positive number is treated the same way, and every negative number is treated the same way. So here I might actually want to say where it's greater than 0. So I want to say where the value is greater than 0. This line's kind of getting a little bit long, so I might push it down like so, boop, and spread it across more than one line. So I might say query is collection or greater than, and then break. Cool, makes sense? So downvotes is basically the same story. My query there would be my downvotes and my downvotes value is less than 0. Cool. Does that make sense for everybody? And notice I intentionally not hard-coded in 1 or -1. I've hard-coded in those as greater than or less than that. Okay. Now, one thing to remember anytime you're writing a case statement, remember you always should have a default clause, right? Because your default clause is to catch things like, oh, I have some additional values that I didn't consider, so maybe we add another value to the enum, then I want to have it have some sort of default behavior, okay? So what should we do? What should we make the default?
All movies.
It's probably a safe bet, okay? So one thing you could do is I could duplicate that case and say this is the default. It's worth mentioning when you're writing a switch statement, that default clause can be anywhere in the switch statement. It can be at the beginning, it can be in the middle, it can be at the end. But convention is you either put it at the beginning or the end. One or the other is convention, but it can technically be anywhere. Okay. Now, I don't typically write my default clause that way. I'm going to do this. Default case all movies, because I want both of those cases to behave the same way. Remember what happens when you don't put a break? It falls through. So this is one of those reasons why that behavior is because in this case, the default case just falls through to the all movies case. So they both have the same behavior, they both have the same code. I don't have to duplicate that code. Make sense? Actually, both Java and C# and JavaScript all have that same behavior where you can put multiple cases together that way. Questions? Yeah.
Is there a way to like combine selections together in the series? Like I think ours was retaining it and have one with like library and wish lists that go together.
That's a good question. I will say that I'm considering making that one optional. Okay, because that's kind of a hard one. So on the instructions, I went in and just put a strike through that. If we have time, I'll talk about that today. The long story short, in order to do two collections together, let's say I want to get the library and the wish list, I can't do that in one query. I actually have to run two queries and stitch the results together. There's not a way to do two queries, to query two collections simultaneously. That's actually two queries, run them together. Okay? That's why I say it's a more complicated thing. So we can do it. If I have time, I'll talk about it. I don't know if I'm going to have time to talk about it today. But does this part make sense? Right? This part makes sense. Now, I've lost one thing in that I got rid of the filter by genre ID. Does everybody see that? Okay. Can I bring that back? So let's say I do that first. And let's try this. Does that work? I say, first, let's pick which list we want, and then we'll filter it down to a specific genre. Does that work? You're shaking your head and saying no.
I mean, you're reassigning the whole query variable.
But notice I started with the query that was above. I say query.where equal to. So I'm taking whatever query I have and then appending a where clause to it.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, that's it.
Does it?
I think so.
I'm going to give you a little bit of foreshadowing here. It doesn't work. Okay. But let's come back to it. Okay. This doesn't actually work.
So because you're not allowed to do where twice, or what?
Let me show you the problem and give you some time to stew about it while we do the next thing. So if I look at the movies collection, look, I've got genre, looks like this, right? So it'd be like genre.action, genre.romance. Under the vote, it's movie.genre.action, not genre.action, because I nested it inside of that document just a second ago. So it depends on whether or not I'm looking at the movies collection or if I'm looking at the movies votes collection. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Does anybody have any ideas? how can we make that work? Well, one option is I could go back to the way I've structured the vote again and say, well, we'll just make it the same and we'll push the genre up, and I'll have to then rejigger a bunch of stuff in order to push the genre up to the root of the document. So that's one option, is we could change the schema. Is there another option that I can do here without changing the schema? Thoughts? Okay, I'll let you brew on that. I'm going to go over to the next question while you're brewing on that. Okay. So we've got those parts in. I'm going to go back to where we call this. Remember? So where do we call filter movies by genre? We call this from main activity. Remember? So when the user picks an option from that first dropdown, we've called this function. So I need to trigger this function from the second dropdown. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay, so back to main activity. We're working our way back. So under main activity, I've already registered a listener for the genre spinner. I need to give a new listener for list spinner. List spinner dot set on item selected listener, new adapter view on item selector. That filled that in. I just need to change some of these names. Parent, view, position, and ID. I really wish it would fill those names in for me, but it doesn't. So just like we did with the other selector, we're not going to do anything if nothing's selected. We're just going to leave that case alone. And in the case where the user has picked something, then I need to do a little bit of logic. So I might say parent dot get item at position, and we can get that position. So if I want to get the option that the user selected, I could do that. Remember how are we populating that second dropdown? So everybody remember how I populated that second dropdown? Huh? What do you mean manually? I hard-coded it? Where did I hard-code it? Yeah, strings XML. So if we look over here in strings XML, remember I used this string array to fill in those values. Okay, so the type of those options is currently a string. Okay, remember the downside of that is I'm going to translate these strings eventually, and so I really don't want that string. Okay, so maybe what I want is the position. So I could do something like, say here, switch on the position and say, okay, case, if the user picks position 0, then we need to call model.filter movies by list, and this would be like movie list dot all movies. Break, and kind of the same for the next case, etc. So case 1, model dot filter movies by list. And do something like this. This makes sense right here? that works. It works assuming I don't change the order of the things in the
I
bracket.
was about to say.
Right, so I've got something a little bit more descriptive because I can see, okay, 0, I'm expecting it to be all movies. 1, I'm expecting it to be more, but my votes. It's at least a little bit closer because now it's in the activity and not all the way over in the view model. So it's maybe a little bit closer to the UI because I can see what spinner this is attached to. So that is a little bit better to do it over here, but I'm still switching on that position. So everybody see that? I'm still switching on that position. I'd rather not be switching on the position. So that makes sense to everybody? Okay. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to kind of step away from having that switch that's based on position. Okay. If I think about things a little bit, when we did the genre filter, thing, remember we got into the case where we needed 2 pieces of information. I needed to know the name of the genre and the ID of the genre. Do you remember that from Wednesday? I needed the name of the genre and the ID of the genre. So how did I solve that problem? How did I get to the point where I had both of those pieces of information together?
You made a new class called genre filter.
Yep. I made a new class called genre filter.
And it contains just the 2 pieces.
Just the 2 pieces. And I have the spinner populated with a list of genre filters instead of a list of strings. So maybe I can make a list of something else, right? Maybe rather than having it populated with a list of strings, I have it populated with a list of something else. What could that something else be? I kind of want those 4 options to appear on the list, right? Maybe I can have the user pick from movie list. Maybe I can just have the user pick from these enum options. That would be my ideal. Does that make sense to everybody? I kind of like them to pick from these. Okay. Now, if I'm going to use that, that means I need to programmatically populate that second spinner instead of using that string array to populate it. I need to populate it programmatically. You'll remember that when I set this up yesterday on Wednesday, that I went and did this here, and I populated it from some data from the genres that were coming from the view model. Cool so far? Okay. So my list of enums doesn't really change, so it's not something I really need to do all this live data business with. It's something I just want to kind of populate at the easy way and not populate based on the data changing. Okay, so let's say we want to populate list spinner, and maybe we say, okay, we've got the, we need to make a new adapter, so array adapter, and this would be movie list. And so this would be like list adapter is a new adapter or array adapter. Remember that the constructor for array adapter needs 3 things. It needs the context, it needs that layout, and it needs an array. So the few arguments there, I need this, Android R simple spinner item as the layout, and then I need kind of the list or the array of movie list enum values. Okay. It turns out there's an easy way to get that list. Movie list.values. So if I take an enum and I call .values on that, that will give me an array of the values in that enum. Cool. So I've just built an adapter that wraps those options. And then I can give that to the list spinner. So list spinner is dot set adapter, and we're going to set that to list adapter. Cool. So now I'm populating it with movie list options, those enum values, instead of populating it with strings. Okay. And you can see it's working because they now look like my enum keys. Everybody see that? So this is kind of the same story that we had yesterday, where it's calling toString on those objects and using the toString. Okay. Now toString with a new, you can see, has a default. The default implementation is different. So default implementation returns like all movies, my votes, my upvotes. It returns the name of that enum value rather than the class, rather than the entire class. But okay, so it's better, but it's really not what I want to show to the user. Does that make sense for everybody? Another gotcha here is, by the same token that I had the other day, I need to go to the spinner and get rid of that entries property. Because otherwise it will start out being populated with strings and then switch over to being populated with these movie list objects. And that'll cause a problem with my listener. Okay? So I need to remember to remove the entries property from there. So I'm removing the entries from both of those. I'm actually going to end up removing the string array for both of these. So at this point, because I'm not populating either of these with those arrays, I don't need those arrays anymore. Yes?
So for some reason, like console adapters,
Yeah?
maybe like when you call like an array adapter constructor,
Yeah.
less than equal sign, like right after it, I have an error for that, but not like the list. They're the exact same, but one has an error.
It was still saying array adapter string, not console filter. Okay. So I say that I've got those things dealt with, just like I did with the other side of things. Remember, I implemented a toString method. Okay. I need to go to movie lists and implement some sort of toString here effectively. So if I implement public, actually just type in toString, public toString, and toString returns, say, something, okay, then I can change what it's doing here, okay. Now, remember when I implemented this on genre filter, I used that name of the genre because I had that piece of data, right? I used an instance variable to render it. So I need to use a similar sort of thing. I need to have some sort of instance variable here So I'm going to say private final string name. Okay. That would be like the display string that I want to render as. I'm going to mark this final. The reason being is because a enum value should never be updatable. They should never change once you've created one. But I need to populate that with something, right? I need to populate it somehow. Well, you might remember that we did a constructor. So maybe I do movie list string name, and I say this dot name is equal to name. So I create a constructor that takes a name, saves it, and I'm going to return name from toString. So kind of the same way I set up the filter. Is everybody following with me there? Okay. Now, that's how I can set this up. You might notice on here that there's a little error because you can't make constructors for enums. They can't be public because you can only have these specified instances of enums, right? So effectively, this has to be a private constructor. And in fact, you notice it's in gray because when you're dealing with enum, the constructor always has to be private, so you actually don't need to include the access modifier, right? If you leave it off, it's the same. I'm going to go ahead and just leave it on for illustration purposes, but it's not needed here per se. Okay. Next up, the place we call that constructor is up here in the specified values. So in there, that's where we're going to say, okay, this is all movies. Yep. So here's where you call the constructors. You say my votes. So Java has this really nice behavior because they're objects. They can contain other bits of data as you need them to. Okay. So I could set up that. And now basically I've got a toString method implemented. It's different for each option. Okay. Everybody good with that? Okay. Warning, this looks like it works. What if I want to render this in Spanish? Notice I've hard-coded those strings. Does everybody see that? What do we usually do to avoid hard-coding strings? Well, we extract them, right? I can't extract these strings. In order to, or I can't simply extract them. The problem is that in order for this, how do I say this? In order for you to get those strings from resources, remember you have to have a context, right? You have to have some sort of activity, typically that you're referring to, okay? I have no way of ever possibly getting a context because these enum values need to be created as soon as you first reference the class. There's no way for me to get a context into this enum. Does that make sense? There's no way for me to actually get a context into this enum. So if I do it this way, then I can't actually unfortunately translate. Okay. I want to show you it because it's a useful tool to have. It's a useful tool to be able to add additional fields to an enum, but unfortunately it doesn't solve my problem because I can't translate it. Does everybody hear me with that? Okay. So what do? Well, I step back and I say, okay, well, this is one way to solve it, but let's step back and think about it the same way that I did here. What if, remember what I did here, is I said I've got an object with two things. I've got the name, the thing that we're going to display, and I've got a value is one that we're going to not show, but it's the value, the ID is the thing that we're going to use to actually filter by, right? So I've just got a piece of two values here. One is the thing that user sees, and one is the thing that user doesn't see, right? So I actually might be better off using the same solution. Does everybody understand me there? So rather than trying to go down that road, I just need to step back and use the same selection. So I might say, let's create a new class. Okay, now to save myself some code, because I'm realizing that, okay, maybe I'm going to be doing this a bunch of times, right? You're starting to see, okay, well, now I can add I've got a genre filter. I might have a movie list filter. I'm going to have an object every time I want to populate a spinner like this, right? But they're all kind of going to look the same. Does that make sense to everybody? They're kind of going to look the same. Maybe I just make a reusable class that I can use everywhere, right? So maybe I'd be more generic and I say, let's make a spinner option. And actually, maybe I want to add that to the UI layer. So spinner option. And that has two things. Private final string. Maybe I say this is the text that we see. And I say private final something, right? Which is the value that the user is selecting, right? So I might say like object value, right? Objects is the parent class of everything, so this could technically work for everything. Does that make sense? Okay. So if I keep going down this route, this would be like public spinner option string text object value. And so this dot text is equal to text. This dot value is equal to value. Implement my toString method, public string toString, and this returns text. So I can kind of reuse this and say, I can use this anytime I'm trying to put something into a spinner. And this will work. The gotcha is because I'm using object here, notice that I'm going to have to cast anytime I use it. Does that make sense? It's going to cause me to cast. So I'd like to have that type for the value to kind of be variable, right? Sometimes I want it to be a string, sometimes I might want it to be an integer, sometimes I might want it to be a movie list. I might want it to have it be a new value. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So this is a really good place for something called a generic type argument, right? So I might use generics here. I declare this class as generic by adding to the top those open less than and greater than signs and then put a letter in there. So basically I'm declaring a letter, which is T, and I'm going to kind of use that variable instead of using the word object. So we've got T here and T here. I also need some getters. So I might add public string get text and this returns text, and public t get value returns value. So rather than creating a new object every time I need a drop down, I can maybe just populate it with spinner options. Does that make sense? You kind of understand why I'm doing that rather than just making another class and making another class and making another class. I might want to make something I can use. Cool? Okay. So in fact, that means that because I have this class now, I don't really need this class. Does that make sense? Because I have this class, I don't really need this class. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete genre filter. That's going to break my code. I'm okay with it. I don't want to do save delete. I'm just going to say goodbye to it. Because I'm going to use this here instead. So I've got spinner option, which is going to replace that class. And I'm going to use it here. So back to main activity. My array adapter. So for genres adapter is now going to be spinner option. What's the type of the value that the user is picking? Yes. What's the type of that value? So remember with the genre filter I had a name and an ID, both of which were strings. So the value is a string. So this is spinner option string. And I'll have another array adapter, which this is list adapter, spinner option, movie list. So spinner option is generic, so it needs a type argument. Array adapter is generic, so it needs a type argument. So you can kind of start seeing these nested type arguments. So everybody good with this so far? Cool. So I've got two variables there, genres adapter and list adapter. One is a spinner option string, one is a spinner option movie list. I'm going to go back to here. I'm going to use that instance variable that I just created instead of the local variable. Okay. Now, because that needs to have a list of spinner options, I need to do a little bit of pre-processing. So I need to actually build that array. So maybe I do spinner option movie list options is oh no, I need a list of or an array of those, not just one. Beep. So I want an array of those options, and so that would be a new spinner option movie list array. And within that, I need my different options. So new spinner option. And so here I'd say like all movies. This would be movie list. Dot all movies. And I'll duplicate that and make 3 more. So my votes my upvotes my downvotes. Pass that in here. There we go. What does that want to do? Okay, so it just wants that to be that's kind of interesting. I don't know why. Okay. Well, it's happy with that right now. Oh, I've got a reference to genre filter, so I've got to get rid of that reference, that import. Here, I need to change this over to spinner option string. New I might move that back to being line. Now it looks like I flipped these things. So it was previously passing in those in the other order. So this is now A and B. Oh, I see what I need to do. I just need a, nope, that's not it. Okay, so I need those pieces, get string and null, and this is new spinner option instead of new genre filter. So this is genre name and genre ID. So I have to flip those because I had them reversed previously. So name and ID. It's ID. Okay. Other thing I need to do here is flip that. So this is a spinner option string. And this would be dot value. Maybe I call that the option now. Option dot value. Oh, I need to get value. That's why. Option get value. Are there any questions there as to what I'm doing and why? Yeah.
I This is kind of the response to your saying that this is bad. Yes. Should second argument would be let's go get swing. You're saying get swing. Do after we want to see it after. Oh, okay. 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 This is the situation with options and stuff. So we get value T, which is your because you're saying spin an option, it needs to be spin an option start. I'm going to pull that, this is that. Kind of like they did before, this John Anderson.
So, I should be able to run it. We're not all the way there yet. Okay. So we've switched that over to use the spinner option instead of using it the genre filter class. But what I wanted to do now is basically, rather than doing a switch statement here, what I was trying to get to is to try and do the same thing as kind of what I did with the first dropdown. So spinner option, movie list, option is equal to this here, cast from parent dot get item at position model dot filter movie by list option dot get value. And I might do the same thing here, filter by list. Okay. So the idea being now that these two are really the same code, right? The option for filtering by the genre versus filtering by the list, the only difference is what generic type I have here and which method I'm doing. Cool. Again, I could have done this by adding another class. I could have kept the genre filter and also added some sort of list filter class. But this is trying to get to a point where I don't have to write so many classes. Okay?
Can you scroll to around line 68?
Yeah. Go up to line 68. So 68 would be here.
Interesting. It didn't like me putting in those open and close greater than signs. The greater than the left hand side.
Yes. Yeah, make sure that you're taking this array that we just created and passing it in to the constructor of that adapter. This change is pretty easy to miss.
So then, how does that affect line 101? It's 101 for me. And that'd be a little bit different for you, but it's this genre adapter. I get the same thing.
This needs to be spinner option string. You have to say what type of spinner options.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so you've got a few different places you need to update. So you need a less than greater than sign there. Same thing here. Yeah. So that's one part. And then I had to make some changes up here. So basically I'm using spinner option string anywhere where I have the genre filter. Because spinner option string is equivalent to genre filter.
Mm-hmm. It is, yeah. So.
Yeah. Cool.
So the genre filter has an ID of type string.
Yep.
And then
It had a name of type string.
it also
So
they all have names.
The name basically became text,
Mhm.
and the ID became value.
Became value. And the list adapter's value was a movie list enum. So enum,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, the values is a movie listed in. So that's what I have there.
Okay. So that's how they're related.
Yes.
Okay.
So one has a type of string and one has a type of movie list. So I picked those things. And so that gets me down to here. And again, trying that, I can try to filter now to just the movies I voted on. And we can see it's a smaller list. But something's not quite right.
You haven't fixed that thing from earlier.
We haven't fixed what?
That thing from earlier.
What thing from earlier?
Well, you asked us to sit and think about. We were in the movie. That's right. We're in the movie
Yeah.
list view model.
Yeah.
Inside the observed movies method.
So in the view model, you're asking a good question. We're talking about this. Remember, I did say if we filter here, it depends on which collection we're filtering in, because remember that the movie data is inside of this movie summary object that's nested inside of the movie property. It's not at the root. Okay. When we render this list, it's actually somewhere else. So look at what's in the registration. Okay. When I go through, I say add snapshot listener, yada, yada, yada. Look at line 251 and 252. So everybody see that? So I'm reading the results and actually presuming, I'm saying query snapshot with two objects, assuming it's a list of movies, not a list of potentially movie votes. Does everybody see that? I'm presuming that the list is the wrong type, which is why all the data is coming up blank, because all that data is nested inside of the summary, right? So let's just see what happens if I say, hey, this is a movie vote and not a movie. I need to alt enter to bring that in. We're close. We've got something else here. Notice that when I do post value, the list of movies, what type is the list of movies?
Movie vote now.
Well, but I don't want to change that. Okay. So, because that, if I start to change the type of my live data, that's going to trickle down and cause a lot more changes. Is everybody with me on that? Okay. So I'd like to not do that. So what we're getting back is not movies, it's kind of movie votes in this condition. Okay. Could I take those and turn them into movies?
You could, yeah.
I could. Okay. So let's say I go here and I say, all right, list, and maybe this is new. Maybe I give this a different name, new votes, and I want a list of movies. This is the new movies. Which starts out as a new list. Actually, I want both of these to be an array list. So make a new array list and maybe loop through the votes one by one. Movie vote, and this is in new votes. So here we've got, okay, new movies. So for each movie that's in here, I need to add a new movie, right? Because I kind of need to say, okay, well, we're getting back a list of movie votes. I need to turn that into a list of movies and use that. Does that logic follow? Do you understand what I'm trying to do here?
You say that again?
So I'm trying to take this list of votes and turn it into a list of movies. Okay. When I'm rendering the list, okay, when I'm rendering this list, am I showing all of the data about the movies? Okay. Am I showing all the data about the movies?
Currently you are, but you said in the future you wouldn't.
Right. Future we won't. Remember that we created the movie summary package, which the movie summary is actually all the data that I'm showing to the user. Does that make sense? You following with me there? So what I'm actually showing to the user is the summary, not the movies themselves, right? And so that's really what I want, okay? So if what I could do is I could say, hey, this is actually a movie summary list. I can go through each of the votes and say we'll add vote.movie, which is a movie summary. Awesome. Now, what is this doing right here? Oh, it's saying assume that it's not null. Oh, that's what we do. At non-null. So I can shorten this up a little bit. If I go through here, I can do this, and then what I want to happen here is I want that to be really movie summary. So I kind of led on saying, hey, I don't want to change this list of movies to a list of votes. kind of because I'm thinking, well, I actually want to change it to a different type. Is everybody on board with that? Right? So what I want to get to is the movies is actually a list of maybe movie summaries. So going all the way up top, all the way up here, these movies, this live data that we created previously on line 43, I actually want this to be movie summary. Is everyone on board with why I'm doing that? Because what I want to end up with is that we don't really need all the data. We just need some of the data to show the list. Cool? Questions? It's going to break a lot of code. Like changing line 43 is going to break a lot of things. Because remember, we've used this list in a lot of places. Okay. So I'm going to have to go change a few things. I actually would rather not have you code along for this little bit because I'm going to have to jump around a little bit. I'm not going to be able to kind of go slow enough to have you follow along. So if you would, I will give this code at the end of the class so you can review it. But I'd rather at this point you take notes rather than trying to follow along. Okay? All right. So I'm gonna change this over to movie summary. That inherently means that the getter needs to change. So I'm going to need to go over to the getter for get movies, change this to return list movie summary instead. That's going to cover the changes here. I'm going to need to go back to, I believe, main activity. And here we'll notice that we're observing that list of movies and we're passing that along to the adapter. Okay, so the adapter needs to change and be a different type. So the movie list adapter isn't getting a list of movies anymore. It's getting a list of movie summaries. So that changes up here. Also changes in the setter. So it's a list of movie summaries here instead. Import class. And then when I go down to here, so now that we've got a list of movie summaries, let me go to onBind first. So in onBind, that first line is going to be a movie summary instead of a movie. I think there's another place where I need to change this. Okay, I'll need to come back to that. I'm going to go up to this. So you'll see in the upvote and the downvote, I'm assuming that I have a movie. I actually have a movie summary because that's what's in this list now. Okay, now you might notice that there's a few places in here I need the ID of the movie. Does everybody see that? Okay. I made a goof, I believe, earlier because when I created the movie summary, I did remove that ID thinking I didn't need it. I need to put it back in. So public string ID, and this is one of those reasons I'm like, just take some notes. So I do need to put the ID back in. I do need to put the ID back in there. So I can do that. That also means in the movie vote, I probably don't want to have the movie ID twice because the movie ID is now in both the vote and the movie summary. So I'm going to take it out of the movie vote. So it's not in the movie vote anymore. It's just in the summary. Which means going back to the view model, I need to say, okay, well, now we're not going to set that here because we've got it in the summary, so I don't want it both places. And then maybe back to where is this? So back to the adapter. That's cleared that part up. You'll also notice we set up this add up vote. This was taking a whole movie because we had the whole movie at the time. I don't have the whole movie, so both of these add up vote methods are taking a movie summary now again. Movie summary instead. So there's a bunch of places that I have to go through and change to be a movie summary instead of a movie, unfortunately. I wish there was an easier way around that, but I don't know that there is, unless I had kind of planned ahead for that, and I'd kind of forgotten about that detail, right? So you see sometimes you get into this place where you do need to refactor a little bit. The good news here is this line, well, is now just movie because it's already a movie summary. Movie. Okay, so movie summary. I'm going to build and see if I have errors anywhere in my code now. Looks like it might be good enough to run. Oh, man. Is it going? Is it not going? Logcat. Crashing. Great. Error. What did I miss? On a null object reference. So it's saying the movie is null. Why in the world is the movie null? Null. Oh, because I assumed that that would not be null. So I presumed that vote.movie would not be null. Okay. Movie class. I see what's going on here. So new movie summaries. And this would be new movie summary, taking in the movie, and oh, there. New movie summary, pass in the movie. Oh, movie summaries. Okay, so I have to untangle a little bit. Okay, back to running. So what ends up being the problem, and why it crashed there initially, is because I was assuming that when I was doing the all movies list, which is the default selected option, I was presuming that those were votes. Okay. So really, I have to say, sometimes I need to do it one way. If we're iterating, if we're looking at a list of votes, and I need to do it a different way if we're looking at a list of movies, depending on which collection I'm putting.
And that's because the list of votes that the movie itself is hierarchically, it's like one nested.
Yeah, it's nested in versus it's not nested in if we're getting a list of movies. Right, so if I'm getting from the movies collection, it's at the root, the data is, but if I'm getting a votes, it's nested inside of the other document. So everybody kind of following along with that? It's kind of a weird thing here. So how do I know which collection I'm entering over? Okay, how do I know which collection I'm querying? Well, let's look at our switch statement. Okay. For what cases am I iterating over, am I dealing with movies? What cases am I dealing with movies?
First two.
The first two.
Default and all movies.
Default and all movies. What cases am I dealing with votes?
All of the cases.
All the other cases. Okay. Now, there's a gotcha here in that I said the default, right? The default is all other cases, right? So if I say, okay, one way I could do this, I could say, well, if the option the user's picked is all movies, it's movies. Everything else, in theory, should be votes, right? But that's not really the case, right? It's not really the case that everything else other than all movies is that, because this default is weird. Okay, so I might want to step that back a little bit and say, oh, maybe we did the wrong thing. Maybe we did the wrong thing with that default. Maybe in this case, I need to do something else. Okay. Because that's going to get us into a weird place if we keep going with that direction. Okay. What might be something else that I could have done with the default case? What were our options?
So what did the default case mean? That means that somebody accidentally puts in another value for the enumerator? Well,
that means, yeah, like we add another value to that enumerator, like another value that could be in the dropdown, right? I could say, I could argue that there's at least two options first. We could say, let's filter, let's go through movies. I could say I could go through votes. A third option I could do is just say, hey, this is an error, let's stop here. And the more I look at this, I think, oh, maybe this is an error case. So oftentimes that may be something you would do, is you would say, oh, at this point, that other option, I don't know what to do with, so we're just going to say that it's invalid. Does that make sense? It's just invalid. I might commonly want to throw an exception in that case. The problem is if I throw an exception here, I think the app is definitely going to crash, which might be good for me. That will then obviously lead me down to looking at why it crashes, looking at the stack trace and saying, oh, okay, there's something here I need to add another case. Does that make sense? and probably lead the developer who added that option to figure out, oh, this is the place where we need to change the type. So an exception might be good there. Another thing I could do is just log and return. I could say, let's log the results and return. But either of those work. So maybe here we say throw new legal state exception unsupported option. And when that happens, it will make the application crash, but at least it gives us a line number to go back to know where to change the code. Cool. Again, if I want to keep the application running instead, I could just log an error and return. Either of those are options depending on what you're going for, right? Yes.
The good news is if you compile this and it runs, you hand this off to anybody to download. There's no way they could get this to occur because they can't change the enum class.
They can't add another enum to it. Okay, and that way I can be a little bit more safe with my other. So effectively, what I want to do is I'm going to say, well, if here, if the filter list, if it's equal to movie list dot all movies, then it's going to be, we know we're getting a list of movies, and I need to turn that into a list of summaries. And otherwise, I know I've got a list of votes, which I need to turn into a list of movie summaries, and so that would look kind of like this. And I still need to say post value, and maybe I name those differently to get back to a similar naming convention. It looks kind of like I can extract part of this. So I'm creating the array list in both sides. So I can move that out of the if. And I'm posting the movies on both sides. So I think I can move that out of the if as well, leaving me just with this. So create a list of summaries, populate it one way, but populate it another, and then finally post an updated one. Yes?
I'm having trouble figuring out, like, movie vote. What would that be?
Yes. Yeah, we will library wish list, right? So depending on the option that the user picked, so like if the user picked all games, then this is going to be a list of games. If the user picked my library, this is going to be a list of library items. If they picked my wish list, it's going to be a list of wish lists. So you're actually going to have three cases here. You might do a switch statement, to be perfectly honest. This is a case you may want to do a switch statement. And maybe I should switch it over too. Maybe I should be doing a switch statement here. Let me do that. So if it's all movies, break case My votes. Break. Tab that in. This would be case. And I might want to do a similar thing with the default to cover that base as well. So I could switch that over to the case statement. Does that maybe help illuminate too some other ways to write this for the wish list and the wish list and the library? So you're gonna have three cases there. Again, you can either write that as a set of statements or you can write it as a switch. Either one is fine. The point is that if we're rendering this in a list, if we're pulling it from two different collections, so we're potentially pulling it from either from the movies collection or the votes collection, I have to end up getting those both to the same list of objects. Does that make sense? I need to get them to the same list of objects. So in this case, I'm getting them both down to be a list of summaries, movie summaries, or game summaries in your case, right? Rather than a list of movies. Because if I wanted to have it as a list of movies, well then I would need all of the movie data inside of the votes or inside of the wish list items. Is everybody tracking with me there? You kind of understand where I'm going with that. One thing I might want to do, just for safety's sake, if vote dot movie does not equal null, then we add it, and otherwise not. Because otherwise there's some potential that if we have older votes, it might not have the nested movie object data. So that guards me against potentially having nulls in the adapter. Cool. Obviously a little bit more refactoring there than I realized that we would be doing. But any questions right now? Does this make sense so far, what we're doing?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Do you understand why I've introduced the enum to this? Does that make more sense now that we're seeing the enum pop up in a few different places? Right? So rather than hard coding some strings or hard coding the number 0, 1, 2, 3 in a bunch of places, which could change, I want to use something that's stable, which would be that enum. And so the enum is not going to change. Or where it's going to be a lot easier to find out, okay, where are all the places where I'm using this enum? Those are the places I need to change if I'm adding an additional value. Cool. Okay. Testing wise, let me actually go to the tablet instead for this, so I have a little bit more screens. Real estate. And I may need to go uninstall just to wipe the data. And is my internet connection going offline? Maybe. Look at. No movies. Okay. So something's up. I'll have to investigate that further. Media manager. Let's go wipe the data. Let's go run this. Okay, so in theory I should be able to go to my votes. And let's just see if I do boop. Something. Okay. Okay.
It's not, it is kind of unchecked like the icon.
Something's not right. That makes me think I've really screwed something up.
The only thing I can guess is that now that since the vote data, the votes movie data is pushed down another level, is that the uploading and downloading thing doesn't work very well. I noticed it shows me my highlighted icons on all movies, but if I go to either of my select the votes,
Curiosity. I got rid of this movie ID because it was duplicated. Maybe I shouldn't have. So maybe on the vote I do need the ID.
Did you add document ID on
Yeah, so I think it is related to this fact that I got rid of the movie ID column. So let me add the field back in. So I'm going to add it on the model here, and I'm going to go to the place where I add it to the database. So I'm going to go ahead and have that where it's duplicated, and I have the movie ID twice. Yes, that's it. So what I goofed up is that, remember when we're pulling down the data, we're converting the votes into these movie vote values. That's the part that I screwed up. That's the part that I missed. So here in this registration, look really close here. I'm on line 79. So when I have a registration for the movie votes, I'm looking for, when I build up these movie vote values, I'm looking for the field movie ID and value within the movie vote entry. So that's expecting there to be a movie ID field at the top. So when I add it back in, it works. Okay. So if I was going to get rid of that, then this would need to be right here, movie.id, right? If I change that line to 79, that line 79, then I should be able to get away with not having a copy. Does that follow?
so what was your initial logic for getting rid of it? Can you explain why you would come to that?
My initial logic was just we probably don't need 2 copies of it. My initial logic was we probably just don't need 2 copies of
2
it.
copies of what?
Of the ID.
So
Of the movie's ID.
Where would the second copy be identified?
In the summary. So I had one in the movie summary and one in the outer level. I can
The outer
go
level meaning the movie field itself?
here. So you see inside of movie, the movie map, I've got an ID field. And I also have it, there. Oh, the other one's still old, that's why. There. So I have ID here, movie.id, and I have movie ID.
Okay.
And so I have the ID in 2 places. Maybe it's not that big of a deal to have it in 2 places, but that's why I was trying to get rid of it.
Which one did we get rid of? We got rid of...
I got rid of this outer one, but the problem was my code only had that one to start with.
I thought you got rid of the inner one. Okay, now I understand.
Yeah, I didn't get rid of the inner one. The inner one was we just have it, and I didn't need that one, kind of. So, yeah, that's what happened, is because I removed the copy. So maybe I should just leave the copy and not worry about it.
You say we don't need the inner one now? Is the inner one not being used for anything particular?
I need the inner one because that keeps... I wanted to keep the inner one because that keeps it kind of the same structure as the movie, like, so it looks like a movie document more. But I guess it's mutually exclusive. I could do one or the other. It just would change the code. So what I may do is I may just leave both of those in there for the moment. I don't know what the right answer is for which side it could be in, but I think there's some value to maybe having it both ways.
So it's as simple as just targeting movie.id if you want.
Movie.id if I wanted the other one.
Will that break for instances in which you've only got a list of movies and not a list of movie summaries?
Yeah, it came down to here. If I didn't have the ID column, if I didn't have the ID column within there, then I would have needed to do like vote.movie.id is equal to vote.movieid. I would have needed to do something like this if I didn't have the nested one to keep those things in sync. Does that make sense? If I didn't have the nested one, I would need to do that. Cool. Okay. This transformation, I knew this transformation was going to be a little bit difficult. I've been kind of mulling it over in my head for how to implement this, how do I pick the other list. It turned out to be definitely harder than I thought it would be to make the switch. I knew it would not be easy, but it definitely turned out to be harder than I expected this change to make. Which is a good reason why I did it in class rather than having you do all of it yourself. But are there any questions right now? Yeah. Where I add a vote? What are you looking for? Maybe 149, is that what you're looking for? Yeah. So I can take this part out, but I'm going to go ahead and commit this. Oh, after all that, we did forget one thing. Remember that we needed to do something here? Remember that we needed to change something for the filter? So maybe what I did here kind of illuminated what we need to do, namely that I also need to put in some sort of if statement. So if we're filtering, then I need to see if the filter list is, if it's all movies that we want, then it's that. Otherwise, it's movie dot genre filter genre. I mean, the main gotcha is that if you're looking at two different collections, those fields may not be in the same place. Might be nested, it might not be nested, depending on what collection you're looking at. So, testing, which is what I was trying to do. I wanted to do this with tablet. Go here. Okay, so I've got my list. There's all the movies. You can see I've got some edge case data here that's missing data intentionally to try and test those things. If I try to go down to just my votes, I should get those. I do get. So let's say I go to there. So if I go to just my votes, that's what I want to see. My upvotes, those are the two that I've upvoted. There's the one I've downvoted. If I go to change my vote on here, see if I remove it, then it actually drops off the list automatically. Because we've kind of already get that by having the snapshot listener set up. Similarly, I could go down votes, uncheck it, and it's gone. So I can quickly add things and remove things from those lists. But the point we were trying to get to is really the feature is now the user can pick just their things, right? They can quickly see the things that are in their library. They can quickly see the things that are in their wish list without looking at the entire list. And the combination of those looks like it is working. So I can combine those two pieces. Yes?
I'm just wondering because my icons are like staying selected whenever I'm they're staying selected when you put in like isn't selected. Yeah. They'll show up. I think that is related to the thing we were just talking about. So go to your game library. Start there. Sorry. You have the game library and you have the game. And so same with game wish list. You have the game library and the game. Inside game summary, you have that user game. Okay, that needs to not have documented.
Okay.
The summary needs to not have the ID.
Okay, I was wondering.
Next thing I would do, I would add and remove it from the list, because it may threaten policy.
Yeah.
And shut the function of the concept. Sorry, you can warn.
I don't know, man. I don't know. I've got two of the same movie here. I'm just gonna go back to the database and get rid of all of my
All your votes?
all my votes.
Yeah, I mean, your votes might have gotten polluted. One way to fix it would be to just vote again, right? Because if you vote again,
I tried. It didn't fix it.
okay,
That was added in the recording.
okay. Yeah, so it may be the data is in kind of a weird state. Okay. A few things to mention. I've added to everybody's databases, I added some invalid data for testing edge cases. I was doing that kind of looking at the projects that you're working with. So if you're looking at your Firebase console, I think I messaged a few people about this. I didn't get to everybody, but in your list of consoles, I added one document that doesn't have any data to kind of test that, as well as under your games, you'll see that there's a few documents that I added here. So like there's one called no data that doesn't have any fields, one that's only got a name, one that's got a name and a year, to try and see what was going to happen. For some of yours, that made your application crash. Okay, so if your application is suddenly crashing, I think I messaged you in that case, but that was what occurred. Cool. So those are definitely things you want to check and you want to test for. Is testing for those cases where there's not data. I did find in my own application that I have a bug, right? And you might have seen that here. If I look at the genres dropdown, you see that there's that blank line. That's because of the no data. That's the empty genre that I added. It's got no data on it. Okay. Probably just want to eliminate that from the options. Does that make sense? Probably want to just eliminate that from the options. So in terms of thinking about how to do that, I wanted to just go over that real quick. When we get the genres back, which is up here, I've got a few different places where I could remove that. I could remove it at this point where we're getting the data back. I kind of would need to do a loop here. I'm not doing a loop. So maybe I would push it back further. So let's say I look at main activity. I am looping through the genres. So a good thing to do here might be to just filter it out at this point. You know, to say, hey, I'm looping through these genres or looping through these consoles, and I might say, well, if that doesn't have a name or an ID, then I might as well just ignore it, right? If genre.id is null, or genre.name is null. Actually, I need that backwards. If it's not null, if both of those things are not null, it's got an ID and a name, then I want to include it in the dropdown, and otherwise I don't want to see it in the dropdown. So that way I don't have it here. That would eliminate that option. Cool. That's a quick fix. The other way I could do this is I'm not presently sorting the list of genres, and I probably should be. And remember, if I sort them by name, then it eliminates everything that doesn't have a name. So the other way to solve this is to just go to the view model and say, well, let's just sort the genres. Let's just order them by their name. So that would sort them and also eliminate any ones that are not. Cool? Okay. Okay. I'm going to commit and push that. There are more fix me's that you can see in the project. There's some other things that we haven't talked about. So those are for another day. But we've got that part fixed up, which is what I wanted to get to. So just a few of those bug fixes and mainly getting that second filter. Again, I'm sorry that took longer than I expected. There was definitely some more gotchas working through how to do that. But you understood why does it make sense why we started with this discussion of how to do it, of different ways that we can do it, right? Because there's at least three ways. There's three different ways I outlined that we could do this. I'm sure that there's many more. And obviously that would change the code quite a bit if you did it differently, right? Okay.